Hi. Thank you so much. As you probably can gather from the title of my book, I am a skeptic of technology, and in many ways I write against the optimism, the techno-optimism, the utopian faith that we place in humanity. But I just wanted to talk about one technology that I actually personally, into my core, harbor utopian hopes for, in which I feel just incredible optimism about. And that technology is called the Humanities. There's so much in our world today that exists as an existential threat because we've neglected the humanities. We've assigned the humanities this second-class citizenship. If you go to a lot of our big universities, if you go to a place like Stanford, I was told the other day that 50% of undergraduates at Stanford study computer science, which is great. Nothing against computer science. The world needs computer scientists. But at Stanford, they struggle to fill history classes, literature classes, because every kid now is in search of producing the next startup, the next great app. And we've drifted as a civilization away from the humanities, away from this incredible piece of technology that we have for understanding human existence. So much of what we do in this world today is based on questions about efficiency. How do we get return on investment? We don't commit to great projects unless we can find ways to measure them. Everything about human life is reduced now to data. And as we make this shift to this new paradigm for measuring human existence, for talking about human existence, we stray from the essential core questions that are asked by the humanities. And those questions really are nothing less than questions about what is the meaning of this life that we lead. And so when you look, I'm going to talk to you today about Google, about Facebook, about Apple, about Amazon, about these corporations and their devices and their sites, which play such a significant role in our lives. But I think one of the perils of our reliance on these technologies, on these companies, on these platforms, is that they lead us along to the questions that are important to them, which are not these questions that are posed in the humanities. And I think that really, if we have any hope as a civilization, we need to return to the things that philosophy, that literature, that history give us. These questions which are ultimately not about efficiency, which are not about the things that can be measured and placed into spreadsheets and splayed out in PowerPoint presentations. Those are the questions that are about morality, that are about ethics, that are about human longing, about love, about meaning. They're spiritual questions at the core. And so I just want to, my thesis is like every argument, which is that I'm constantly in search of confirmation that I'm right. And last night I had a moment where I was like, you know what? I am so right. I was going to the bathroom at a restaurant, and I don't know if to the women in the audience, you will probably have no insight into this, but when you walk up to the urinal, you see a row of guys sitting there peeing, looking at their cell phones, and hopefully they're well trained and their aim is good, and you can't help but marvel at their one-armed dead aim. But the point is that we're so addicted to these phones that there's not even that moment when we have to urinate that we can be separated from them. Now, I'm talking to you as somebody who admits that I have a deeply conflicted attitude towards technology. I don't think anybody who picks up a piece of technology can't help but have a deeply conflicted relationship to it. I mean, there's so much about these devices that's actually quite wonderful. I mean, it's, just your ability to literally navigate the world is infinitely easier because of these devices. The ability of Weve to get you around a mess of traffic, you know what? Thank you. I'm very happy that exists, and I want to come to you and say that it's possible to be a critic of technology and our relationship to technology without saying, without saying we need to throw these things into Lake Michigan. It's possible for us to reset and recalibrate our relationship to these devices. But I have to tell you that I struggle with this. When I want to get a good night's sleep, I tend to put my phone in my basement 3 stories below, because otherwise there'll be that moment in the middle of the night where I'll wake and I'll, in a zombie-like state, grab for my phone and get stuck in some sort of endless scroll. You wake up, your circadian rhythms have been disrupted. You have no memory, no recall of that thing that you saw in the middle of the night. And it's not an accident. It's not an accident that those guys were standing there taking a piss and looking at their cell phones. It's not an accident that I grabbed from my phone in the middle of the night. We are the dogs who are in the middle of this Pavlovian experiment that's being run on our species right now out of Silicon Valley. That those companies are creating devices, creating platforms that exist to addict us. They don't say it that way. They say that they're trying to increase the engagement of users. But really, the commodity that they have, that they're selling, is our attention. And therefore, everything that they do is about commandeering more of our screen time, more of our attention every day. That's what their fortunes rest upon. And so how do they do that? Well, what they do is they monitor us. They surveil the hell out of us. They collect data. Because the price of computing is so cheap, they can save every single shard of information about you. So Facebook, for instance, doesn't just capture your photos. It doesn't just know your friend sets. It doesn't just know the things that you've shared in your news feed. It doesn't just know the things that you've liked. It doesn't just know the websites that you've traveled to. And it doesn't just take that information and then aggregate it with other information that they've bought from data brokers in the real world, where they know what you've probably bought at CVS through your loyalty program, et cetera. But Facebook even collects the messages that you begin to write, but you've decided to delete. What is data? Data is really this portrait of the inside of your head. They have a cartography of your brain. And the way that it works, what's done is that they've saved all of this information, and then they have algorithms that are able to process that information, and they're looking for things that provide correlations. And ultimately, they're looking for the things that addict you. They're looking for the things that give you pleasure. They're looking for the things that provide you with anxiety, the things that rile your emotions, the things that keep you engaged for as long as possible. And then they take that information. This is what Facebook does. It takes that information. It takes this intimate portrait of the inside of your brain. It takes this cartography of your mind. And it then shapes the news that you read in order to exploit that information. Facebook is not just your friends sharing news or portraits of puppies, etc. It's a hierarchy. So they take this ocean, this sea of information, and they provide order to it. But that order that they're providing is not done to enhance your ability as a citizen to make good democratic decisions. It's not done for the sake of providing you the things that are most popular. It's done in order to keep you there for as long as possible. And I think we've seen from our recent experience in American politics and global politics just how dangerous it is to have a primary ecosystem for consuming news and information to be shaped by raw emotionalism. And the problem is it's not just Facebook exploiting that system. It's created a system with a set of rules that can be easily exploited by outsiders. That's what the Cambridge Analytica scandal was all about. That's what the Russia scandal is about at its core, as far as we know. I guess stay tuned on what else is to come in the Russia scandal. But what we know is that with Facebook, that you had Russians and you had others exploiting the rules of Facebook in order to tap into that emotionalism, because they knew if they produced content that was perfectly calibrated to Facebook users, that they could shoot up to the top of the news feed. They knew that Facebook would reward them for producing the sort of emotional, anxiety-producing content that would rile voters. And so that's what's ascended. So we live in this world that is just dominated by monopolies, by these four companies that exist at a size and scale that is, I think, unfamiliar to us. I mean, of course, we've had monopolies forever and ever. And on some level, capitalism really is about producing monopoly. Everybody wants to win domination over a market. That's victory in capitalism. But I contend that there is something different about these companies because of the ways in which they've both integrated themselves into our lives, but also the ways in which they've integrated themselves into our economy and into our public square. So you take a company like, let's say, Amazon. Amazon began as a bookseller, and then Amazon, as it grew, became the everything store. But that being the everything store, which sounds like a pretty big ambition for a business to me, was insufficient for Amazon. And so now Amazon powers the cloud, so that every other business really is now dependent on Amazon to house its data, to house the information that it puts on the web, to house the back end of their businesses. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Amazon is one of the biggest movie studios. It is one of the biggest television networks. Amazon owns Whole Foods. Amazon this summer was considering purchasing Regal Cinemas. It's expanding into the physical world now with the convenience stores and the bookstores that it produced. I mean, it's really so sad to me that I was just talking to the organizers of the festival, and they were saying that downtown Chicago doesn't have a decent bookstore anymore. Downtown Chicago. I mean, Chicago. It's kind of an astonishing thing to consider. And Amazon, of course, played a significant role in that development. And perversely, because of the virtual Amazon bookstore ran out of business, Barnes & Nobles and Borders and these other chains, not to mention the independent bookstores, it cleared the space then for Amazon to come back in with the sucker punch to produce physical bookstores We just got 2 physical Amazon bookstores in Washington, D.C., where I came from. And it just seeing their presence is kind of an enraging thing. Or you take a company like Google. Google began with, I think, a pretty immodest mission, which was to organize the world's knowledge. And yet, that's not sufficient. And so Google keeps on expanding. And so we know the ways in which Google is racing right now. It's an artificial intelligence company that's going to build the first driverless cars that are on the street. Google has a life sciences company that has probably what you would describe as a similarly immodest mission, which is to beat death. They want to. I think Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, has described cancer as being kind of an engineering problem. It's just a small thing to solve. Anybody can beat cancer, but to beat death, to achieve immortality, that's a real mission that's worthy of a venture capitalist funding. And so these companies keep growing and they keep expanding, and our relationship to them is different than our relationship to past monopolies, because they are the portal through which we interact with reality. Google is the way in which we make all of these decisions about what restaurants we want to go to. They want to become, through their devices, these things that we pick up constantly all day long, the portals through which we consume entertainment and information. Right now, there's this race in Silicon Valley to produce personal assistants. So they want to tuck themselves into our bedrooms, into our kitchens with these little speakers that we're supposed to be in conversation with all day long. And you think about the power that ultimately has. First of all, the creepiness of it is kind of inherent, right? Google is sitting right next to my bed and listening all the time. And it just kicks into action if I say, "Hey, Google." But think about the power that it has. If you think about the search engine, and when what Google's power is, what Facebook's power is, even Amazon's power, is that they pick winners and they pick losers. So the thing that rises to the top of the Google search engine is the thing that you pick. If you're searching for a place for a new bicycle, what you see in the first 2 or 3 Google entries are going to be the things that you click on, and only the most dogged of us will make it to the bottom of the page. And only the unemployed of us will make it to page 2 or 3. And so it's incredible power. But if you think about these speakers and you ask questions of the speakers, "Hey, Google, what socks should I buy?" It'll supply you probably with just one answer. And so you're not even having the illusion of choice that you have when you're looking at Google search engine results. And so these devices move into our bedrooms and our kitchens, and we already have this one device that's attached to our butts all day long, or sitting in our pockets, the phone. And some of us wear Apple products on our wrists, and we know that everybody's competing to try to produce something, this augmented reality. There was the Google Glass experiment, which failed, but we'll come back at some point to wear the technology on the bridge of your nose. And Sergey Brin, who is the other co-founder of Google, talks about the day where Google is going to be implanted in your brain. You can laugh, but at a certain point, I stopped disbelieving these companies, because when I was a kid, if somebody told me, "You know what? There's going to be a day where you're going to have this device that you can stick in your pocket, and you can watch every TV show ever produced by humanity and read every book that's ever been written," I would have said, no way. Go away, Isaac Asimov. That's impossible. But science fiction becomes reality. The other thing that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are investing really heavily in right now is this human-machine interface. So, it's kind of bad enough that Facebook saves every post that you've ever deleted. But what they imagine is that there will be some technology that will allow Facebook to read your brain waves, and so that you don't even have to type a post to Facebook. You can think it. Like I said, it seems implausible to me, but what do I know? I'm a humanities guy. So we're in the process right now of merging with machine. This is not a new process. We've always been merging with machine. This is a very long process. What are hammers? Hammers are an extension of the arm. What are factories? It is the automation of upper body strength. But we're merging with technologies in a more profound sort of way. And the technologies that we're merging with are intellectual technologies. And the thing that we need to remember is that we're not just merging abstractly with devices or technologies. We're merging with the companies that provide the architecture for these technologies, that run these technologies, and that exist to make profit from them. And so as we merge with these machines, we're actually merging with the companies that own the machines, that operate the machines. And their values end up becoming our values. We may not perceive it, but they exist in order to transform our daily practice, our behavior, our patterns. And one of the things that I find really, one of the most interesting things that I think I've done in the course of researching this book is really I've just sat and I've watched on YouTube, of course, the founders of these companies talk. Now, when you read the technology press, everything that they mention has to do with the resolution on the new iPad or some new gizmo or a new camera, and that's all great. But it's really, if you listen hard to Larry Page or to Mark Zuckerberg, they say profound things about human civilization, about human nature, that they have a real vision for where they want to carry us as a species. And one of the things that's so striking is that Silicon Valley is oftentimes described as libertarian. And it's true, there are a lot of libertarians in Silicon Valley. And none of the companies pay their fair share of tax, which is kind of they can justify on libertarian grounds. But really, if you listen hard to them, what you hear is a sort of collectivism. That everything in Silicon Valley is about the social. It's about the network. It's about social media. It's about crowdsourcing. They love the concept of the hive mind. And once you start to get an ear for hearing their collectivism, the thing that you start to realize is that perhaps that's the reason why these companies have been so insensitive to the prerogatives of the individual, of individualism, of individuality, why they've rolled privacy, which is the very prerequisite for being an individual. It's the reason why they celebrate monopoly as the Platonic ideal of capitalism. And it's the reason why, on some level, they want to take their algorithms and have them substitute for our own free will. Instead of us constantly being in a world where we're making choices all day long about our fate. They prefer to have a world that's efficient, that alleviates us from the burden of choice. Zuckerberg talks about a frictionless world that he imagines existing. And so, to me, this is really scary. I come to this really, I'm a journalist, and journalism was my entree into thinking about these sorts of questions. And I had a window into this where I had worked at a little magazine called The New Republic, which was based in Washington. We existed for over 100 years. And the magazine had this savior who descended upon us, I'd been the editor for a while. We were struggling with our transition to the digital world. We kept having to chase new investors, but in walked through the door this 28-year-old who was intellectually curious, who really understood social media well. And that happened to be because he had been Mark Zuckerberg's roommate in college. He'd been Facebook investor or employee number 3. He was worth $700 million, and he said that he wanted to help us thrive, and so he was buying our magazine. And it was this incredible thing, and our magazine, for a brief period, became this symbol of hope about how journalism could make a dignified transition to the new era. And for a while, it was terrific. But then, at a certain point, his name was Chris Hughes. And at a certain point, Chris, about 2 years into his tenure, started to get a little bit panicked because we were spending a lot of money and we weren't generating revenue. And he said, you know what, we need to turn this around quickly. And I don't like selling ads, but there's one way in which we can do that, which is through social media. That because if you produce content for Facebook, you can quickly garner massive audiences, and with that audience comes revenue. And so he hired a data guru to sit on our editorial staff. And the New Republic had been this little magazine that had been committed to being contrarian, almost contrarian to a fault. And if you wanted to if you wanted to get me to spike a piece, all you would have to tell me is that the argument was conventional wisdom. But as we began to try to make this transition to producing pieces for Facebook, our values, our logic of thinking about journalism and thinking about the world suddenly became Facebook's logic, because we needed to produce the things that would succeed. So we needed to figure out ways to game that system to produce what they call content that would flourish on Facebook. And so we went from being a magazine that was about being against the conventional wisdom to being a magazine that was obsessed with what was trending. And so you see this happening in the world writ large, where the strange thing about the internet is that even though it offers the promise of personalization and customization, and everybody's supposed to be able to find their niche on the internet, you also see this kind of strange homogenization and conformism that begins to creep into this world. I'll give you an example. There was a lion. His name was Cecil. He was like the Kim Kardashian of lions. And he was an endangered species. He'd become kind of a poster lion for endangered species, and he was killed by a Minnesota hunter. And the Minnesota hunter posted a picture on Facebook, and everybody was rightly outraged. And so you see that it's starting to explode on Facebook. And so every publication in the world sees this trend starting to develop, and they start to think, how can I scrape some traffic here? How can I profit from poor Cecil's sad demise? And so every publication from The New Yorker to BuzzFeed and everybody in between ends up finding a way to write several articles about Cecil the lion. And in the end, there were 3.2 million articles written about the death of Cecil the lion. Now, I would contend to you that Donald Trump is the political equivalent of Cecil the lion. So media knows better that when Donald Trump was on the rise, media knew better. When he was talking about Barack Obama's birth certificate, why did media pay attention to that? Who was Donald Trump? What authority did he have to raise these sorts of questions, and who really cares? But what happens is that you have conservative media who could see the ways in which Trump was tapping into the reptilian brain of their core audience. But and liberals in mainstream media could see the same. They could see that people like you probably were pretty pissed off when you heard Donald Trump questioning Barack Obama's citizenship. And they knew that if there was an article written about Donald Trump questioning Barack Obama's citizenship, odds are that you would share that on Facebook, or you would click, or you would get outraged in some sort of way. And this is what's happening. We live in this world where we've created this public square that's being dominated by a handful of companies, and they've created these what are called filter bubbles, where we exist within our political tribes, where we're fed information through these companies, and because of their dominance of this ecosystem, where our emotions are constantly being toyed with. It's not a coincidence that we live in this age where everybody's political feelings are so raw, where democracy around the world is in the process of collapsing because of it. It's not a coincidence that we live in a world where demagogues are flourishing, because this new media ecosystem is all about manipulation. Manipulation is not a bug of the product. It is the product. And furthermore, because we're constantly being manipulated, we've become, as a society, intellectually incapacitated. We are constantly seeking confirmation of our biases. We're growing flabby, where when fake news arises, we want to believe it because that's the way that we've been trained. But there's hope. And hope comes in several forms. One is that I think that the public is starting to awaken to the perils of technology, and especially to the big tech companies. That the election of Donald Trump and the scandals around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook have produced a backlash against some of the big tech companies that I think is really important. That pressure is being applied. You see the employees of these tech companies now starting to rise up against the tech companies, which I think is a really heartening development. That the owners of the companies may not have a moral conscience, but the engineers who work for them do. And they don't want to be complicit in a system that denigrates democracy. Secondly, there's the return of antitrust. That we've got this wonderful tradition in our country of being not just being skeptical of power, but of having mechanisms that grow out of our Constitution and the core values of our founders that are all about constraining power. And in the realm of communications, this country has actually a fairly good record on it. That the post office was the first communications monopoly in this country. And when the telegraph came along, you know what we said? you can't extend your arm into this. And so we left that to private business. And when Western Union managed to gain a monopoly in the telegraph business, there was threats. Ulysses S. Grant threatened to nationalize the telegram again. And that pressure meant that that Western Union didn't extend its arm into the telephone business when that came around. And AT&T had this monopoly in telephony, which lasted for an extended period of time. But the government in World War I said, you know what? You can't get into the radio business. And then when NBC got too powerful, the government broke it into NBC and ABC. And then the Nixon administration created the cable business. And then one of the most important things that's happened over the course of the last 30 years in our political economy was that the government sued Microsoft when it was using its monopoly to prevent them from exploiting the internet browser to kill competitors. Because of our antitrust laws, Google was created. Microsoft would have strangled it in its crib if it wasn't afraid of the government taking action. And so this is a wonderful tradition that should be applied to these companies today. And then finally, there's what we can do. That there are all sorts of addictive things that we face in our world. Food is addictive. Food has been reverse engineered in order to create us, in order to exploit our human weaknesses, so that when a bag of Doritos is in front of people, it's actually chemically created in order to try to get us to go to the bottom of the bag. Alcohol has addictive potential. And yet, with food and with alcohol, we figured out how to live in a state of moderation with these addictive forces in our world. And we need to find a way to live in a state of greater moderation with our technology. And there's an example I find extremely hopeful from our recent history, which is that when Jeff Bezos unveiled the Kindle, everyone said that paper books would disappear. Nicholas Negroponte, who ran the MIT Media Lab, said by the year 2015, there would never be a paper book published ever again. And you could see why he came to that conclusion. When Jeff Bezos set the price for the Kindle, for the first ebooks that were in mass circulation, it was $9.99. It was a hell of a lot cheaper than paper books. It was incredibly efficient. You didn't have to go to a store to buy a book. You didn't even have to wait for it to come to you in the mail. It would appear in a matter of seconds on your device. And so what happened? Everything we hear about technology is that it has this internal logic. It's inevitable. There's nothing that you can do to fight the tide of technology. And if you do, you're a fuddy-duddy in a square. But I think that subconsciously, a lot of us have made a decision. I know that when the Kindle came online, I bought a Kindle. I bought replacement Kindles. I thought this is incredibly great technology. It's enhancing my ability to be a good reader. But over time, I found myself gravitating back to paper books. So the history of reading is really about us moving from public spaces to private spaces. When you go back to the Middle Ages, reading was actually, the book was a magical creation because you had priests reading the Word of God to illiterate audiences. Reading happened in public. Storytellers would come to villages and they would read to the illiterate villagers. But then, with the development of capitalism and the printing press, things started to change in a major way. Reading went from being this public activity to being one of the most profoundly private things that we do. When I read, I like to read in the bathtub, sorry for the image, or my bed, or away from everything else. And when reading went from being a public act to being a private act, the world changed. Subversive ideas flourished. Because once reading stops being a group activity, it becomes one in which we engage and rely on our own imaginations. We don't think about the opinions of other people. It becomes the ultimate individual act. And so I contend to you that with the Kindle, with the ebook, with this gravitation back to paper, I think we collectively, subconsciously, are gravitating to the private. We don't want to read in spaces where we're being surveilled. We don't want to read in spaces where where people are always trying to notify us with their pings and dings and to try to take us away from that train of thought that we're building up. We don't want to read in spaces where we're umbilically connected to some corporate store. And so I submit to you that the preservation of the paper book, it's flourishing in our society because paper book sales increase a little bit each year, despite their cost. That we're making decisions based on what we believe to be virtuous for ourselves and for our world, and that we're actually engaged in an act of resistance, where we're taking time still to do the thing that's less efficient because it tends to our human core. And it's really a beautiful thing. And so I'm going to throw it open to questions and answers, but I just wanted to say kudos to you in this room for continuing to be readers because you are the resistance. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you would like the mic. Please make sure to speak into the mic clearly so that everyone can hear. And why don't we start up top? Kelly, do you have someone?
Can you speak a little bit about monetization? There are some paradigms in other industries where consumers actually band together and push back and demand a royalty in response to their purchasing habits. Do you see anything like that happening with social media? And eventually consumers realizing what the going rate for them are and their purchasing habits and being able to extract some of that back,
Yeah.
or at least some control back.
Right. So I think this is one idea that's kicked around a lot, which is that that we should get paid for our data. Because when you give your data to the company, all these products look free. And so Gmail is great. You're getting this wonderful service, but in exchange for that, you're actually paying an incredibly high price, which is that you're giving them all of your data. That when they're using Gmail, they may not be reading your email, but their computers are reading your email, and they're learning from them, and they're getting better, and they're finding new, different ways to sell you things. And of course, in your Gmail, there are ads that are embedded, which are incredibly subtle, but that's not a major stream of revenue. They're using it to kind of for their bigger ambitions and purposes. And so, I think that I don't see I think we're so far from the moment where consumers would band together and say to Google, "We're not going to use you unless you pay us for your data." I mean, the truth is, the problem that I'm describing in general is this one of dependence. And so we all feel so dependent on these companies, it's hard for us to even imagine ever staking out that kind of rebellious stance that you're describing there, which is why, in the absence of our inability to protect ourselves, we need to turn to other entities to protect us, which is why we need government in some way, shape, or form to protect us. And one of the incredibly gobsmacking facts about the internet is that there is no law that protects our data. Europe has one right now, this general data privacy regulations that they implemented last May, which I think are a little bit feeble, but they're at least something. We have privacy protections when it comes to our medical records, and to some extent with our banking records, but there's nothing that establishes protections for our data. And so I think that I would like to see a couple things happen, which don't seem that radical to me, but nobody's really talking about them. Number one, when you go to a web page, there should be, for the first time, there should be a button that says, I accept your surveillance of me, or I want to read your web page without you collecting information on me. It should be that simple. It should be that binary. And if they want to charge you to get into their website, that's fine. We should have to pay for information. It's information can't be totally free. Wikipedia, maybe there's like nonprofits that like Wikipedia that can be free, but most information needs to be commercialized, and so it should be commercialized. And then you should have a right to make your data disappear. You know how hard that is? It's so I had a Facebook account, and at a certain point, I got disgusted with Zuckerberg's evasiveness and dissembling, especially after the election, that I thought, even though I just wrote a book about these companies and how much I dislike them, I'm sure listening to you, Mark Zuckerberg, whatever you're doing is 20 times worse than I know, because you're dissembling about the most basic facts. And I said, let me try to delete this. And ironically, I had to Google how to delete Facebook. It's not so intuitive. There's not a button, and it's very hard.
We've got a question right over here.
Thank you. This is a question about education. A few years ago, I attended a lecture by Chris Hughes, and this was right after he had purchased the New Republic, and I asked him this question, which I'd like to ask you as well. Say 30 years from now, do you think there will be people who have the chops to write the kind of profound investigative articles that we've seen in the past in the New Republic, that we see in the Atlantic today? Thank you.
Yeah, it's so I do worry. Well, so there are two. The question about how we're being rewired is a really interesting one, and one of the things that I'm optimistic about is that there's still young people who seek out careers in journalism. The way that we train them is not necessarily one that kind of points them in the path where they could become adept at acquiring the skills that enable great investigative journalism. One of the things that's so strange about walking into a newsroom is that everybody looks so young. And maybe that's always been the case, but I as I go along in my career, from being where I started off as a young person, there were always older people. I'm now I'm 44 years old. I should not be the old person, right? But I actually am one of the older people in my newsroom at the Atlantic. And I think it's because so much of journalism is now produced in a commoditized sort of way, where there was this trend towards aggregation that began, and also this trend towards writing what are called hot takes, which are very opinionated reactions. And there's not the same sort of apprenticeship system that was built into journalism for so long, which was about covering school boards and police beats and all these other things that actually teaches you how to report as opposed to spout off. And so I do worry about that to some extent. The thing that here's one thing that I really actually, journalism right now is actually, I think, it's a mixed picture. So what's happened is that you've had the number of journalists in this country has shrunk incredibly. Since the year 2000, I think we've shed hundreds of thousands of jobs because of, it's not just because of the internet, it's other changes that have happened as well. And that's come at a huge expense at the local level, where newspapers don't exist now in a lot of towns. And so really the worst abuses of power are tend to be local ones. Because if you're a bully who's operating in a small place, it's easy to capture that place. And there's a lot of corruption that happens locally. So I worry a lot about that going unexposed. Nationally, you could say that the Trump administration has kind of brought on this revival of investigative reporting, that you have at least two newspapers in the form of the Washington Post and the New York Times going after one another in this kind of epic struggle of titans. But I do worry about a lot of this, and that there, even a paper like the Wall Street Journal isn't what it was. Is an investigative force, and so you look at the Trump administration, which is the biggest, fattest, juiciest target for investigative reporting in modern American history. And there's chunks of it that we have no idea what's happening, because all the reporting is focused still on the show, the big show, which is Trump. You're not focused on what's happening in the agriculture department or it focuses on the EPA when it becomes, or the Interior Department when you have secretaries who are doing things that are incredibly egregious. One thing that I do worry about is the fate of literary fiction, which is kind of associated to the question that you're talking about, which is that fiction actually, and in a lot of long-form journalism, requires a certain training and a certain attention span in order to engage with. And we saw what happened with poetry, where going back 100 years, poetry had a different place in American life than it does now. That poetry was something that was consumed by the masses. To be an educated person meant to have a familiarity with poetry, but also how to read poetry. And now poetry has become this kind of esoteric thing that doesn't really have a deep place in our life. It's not something that we're trained to be able to read. And I think in some ways, as our attention spans have been rewired, it becomes harder and harder to read poetry, because it requires that kind of careful, close engagement with each word, each line. And I worry that the same thing could happen to literary fiction. And I talked about book sales. Book sales in nonfiction are going gangbusters right now, because people want to read Bob Woodward's Fear, or they want to read nonfiction because it actually also taps into a lot of their emotions. Look at the bestseller list right now and how many of the books are about politics. Fiction sales, serious literary fiction sales, are on a longer decline, and so that, I think, would be a really tragic loss.
We have time for just one more question. We're going to go right up here.
Just addressing exactly what you said, two novelizations of your argument about the loss, neurologically, what it does to our thought processes and our ability for sustained thought. The novelizations of your argument, the word exchange and lexicon. And do you know either of those? The word exchange by...
I spend too much time on my iPhone to be able to... I don't
Lexicon is a humorous thing of the librarians becoming a subversive society.
Yeah.
And it's very, very amusing.
Librarians are pretty obvious revolutionaries.
by Alana Graydon. It's called The Word Exchange, How You Lose Your Ability for Sustained Thought. And the other, Lexicon, about the poets becoming the subversives who help. So it's really your argument in fictional form.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. And we will be having a book signing out in the lobby, out front by the windows. Thank you.